announcements, and then we'll get to our Q&R. Maybe I'll just do this seated. This is nice. All right. I just wanted to run through our usual announcements. That is not the right order. Welcome to Home Church. I will remind us of our mission, our vision as a home church, and that is to be a community becoming like Jesus, where people come home to God. We like to remind each other of this every single Sunday so that we never lose focus of what we are all about. Next slide, please. If you're new here, welcome. We're so happy to have you. If you did not grab a black bag that's at the entrance, please do. It's just our way of saying thank you for being here. And if you have any questions at all about our church, about our serve team, about getting connected, baptism, communion, you name it, please scan the QR code or text that number on the screen. Text connect to that number, or there's also connect cards in front of you, and you could fill them out, and we'll get in touch with you. Next slide. So one of the big ways we stay aligned to our mission as a church is to be in community groups. Right now we've been having one Friday community group, and it's been going great. And we are actually adding another one on Wednesdays, which will be hosted by Ryan and Alex. And it's starting this Wednesday, correct? But we do need to know who is interested in participating in order to launch the group officially. So please, 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 if you can, scan the QR code or text table to the number that's on the screen so we can know if you're interested in community groups. And if Friday or Wednesday do not work for you, please text what will work for you, because who knows, maybe there's a few other people that want to join your date that works for you. So please, please stay in touch. We believe that community groups are super important to the life of a believer, to stay plugged into a community. Next slide, please. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you to all of you who give, who are members of our church, who consider Home Church their family. If you're new here, please disregard this slide. This is not for you. This is just for the people that attend our church regularly. Thank you for your generosity. And if you want to give, QR code is on there, and so is the number to text. And there's a donation box in the back. And I believe that is it. I'd like to invite the teaching team and Joy, I believe, to the stage, and we'll get started with our Q&R.
Well, it's good to see you. And here we are at the end of our book of Exodus. And we're doing something different. So, can you give it up to the teaching team who went through this whole thing, and to Joy on stage as well? Thank you. So, the format of Q&R is questions and responses, and it's primarily because it's hard sometimes to give answers to everything, especially when we're going to open up a section today where you can ask questions, and for those, it's really hard to sort of prepare. We did receive some questions from you. After pulling them out of you like pulling teeth, you finally have submitted enough questions for us to have this Q&R. And so we're going to try and formulate different responses to it. We've kind of looked into the background and tried to bring up something that will be useful to you. But before we begin, here's maybe some of the shared assumptions that I want us to have about what we're talking. One is that we're approaching Exodus as scripture, right? So today, our discussion is centered from a Christian perspective. We're looking at it as God's word, and we're asking what it reveals about God. And so our questions are primarily surrounding that. We're also, when I'm reading scriptures and when we're teaching them to you, even though we usually are acknowledging a skeptic in the room, right? Somebody who's a guest who shows up and is really looking at the scriptures with questions. But when we read the scriptures as to teach it or to grow from it, we read it with trust in God's character. We begin with this idea that He is good and holy and just, and so we're looking in the text, even if the part seems difficult or something is challenging. We don't just challenge then the whole character of God. We look at it, the whole scriptures, and we see how would then in this situation the answer play out. We're not doing apologetics tonight. We're not going to be debating or defending the Bible or arguing over its reliability or addressing objections. Historical details, we'll touch a little bit on it, but we're not going to talk as much about that, more about the text and what God is communicating through it, which is the primary intention why Exodus was written, is to communicate something about God and something about how He moves in the world. And then maybe an acknowledgement that some questions will not have complete answers. There are some things that God revealed to us and other things that they're just not revealed. And as much as we would like to know everything, some tensions remain unresolved. And then finally, even as we talk about information, even as you dig into your Bible studies and learn things, keep in mind that the goal is not just information. Right? The goal is not to just for us to become super knowledgeable with Exodus. Don't miss the main point, which is an invitation to be transformed, to become like Jesus ultimately, to become like God, like the Yahweh that Moses met on the mountain. And so with that, I think we'll move into the first questions, and then I'm going to step out and come back, because we are going to go into the question, then we're going to do it at the end, the Bible Project one. So here is the first question, if we want to talk about what is the historical date for Exodus, is something that was submitted. And feel free to launch it off. What is the historical date for Exodus?
I know that Stan said he watched a really long podcast in this, so Stan, you can take it away.
I remembered everything from the 10 hours 1 year ago perfectly, and I will recite it. No, this is actually an interesting question because, if we're reading the Bible and the Word of God as Scripture, and we believe that it's a historical document as well, and what's said in there is true, then, if we can't back it up at all with archaeology or geographic things, then, there's also the possibility of taking it as just stories and lessons, and it doesn't defeat the fact that Jesus came and He died for us. But that is not what the case is. Although there isn't a specific date set for the time of Exodus, there's kind of two dates that are discussed by scholars, and that's 15th century BC and 13th century BC. The 15th century BC date comes from, I'm not going to recite the specific passages, but there's a couple of passages in the Old Testament from Samuel, I believe, where it gives dates. I think it was dating back from the date that Solomon had built the temple of God, and it says that it had been about, I want to say 900 years or so before then. That's where that 15th century date goes. But there's explanations for that where, that specific amount of years that was given was more of a generational date, where it was referring to a specific amount of generations just multiplied by us. I think it was 40 years per generation, and so that's how we get that 15th century date. But that one is not as favorable as the 13th century BC date, which it kind of is on this basis. If we remember reading in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, it talks about these storehouses which they had built up in Ramses. And so, the Pharaoh Ramses II had, it's well known that he had established kind of in that, it was that delta region around that 13th century. And so there's also, they were called, there's a late 13th century BC historical document that's not biblical, which talks about how the Israelites, they had already been established in the land of Canaan. So we know by the late 13th century BC that the Israelites were already out of Egypt. And so, that's kind of the two significant portions of that. But if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job at explaining the two different timelines. I guess the one thing that stood out to me is that, I think it's called the early date and the late date. So the early date was 1446 BC, and that was, like Stan mentioned, 1 Kings 6:1, that says, in the 480th year of the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. And that says that this was 4 years into Solomon's reign. So backdating from there would be basically looking at this passage, it would be saying that this is the exact date, exact number of years that went by. However, like Stan mentioned, the archaeological and of the time, dating back to 1446 BC, is you could see that there wasn't a lot of evidence. And even I think where the main city, where the Pharaoh lived, it wasn't in North Egypt, but it was in South Egypt at that time. So like looking at historical records, it's kind of like, so it's either you believe that date to be a fact or, the late date, which you would look at that date and you would say that it's symbolic. And like Stan was mentioning, 480 basically means 12 generations went by, 12 times 40, and 40 is a symbolic number, 12 being for the amount of tribes in Israel. And so people start thinking that it could have been a symbolic date rather than an exact date. So that's why this confusion exists. The last thing I wanted to mention is it would be a lot easier if a pharaoh was mentioned in Exodus, but there was no pharaoh mentioned. There's two pharaohs, neither of which was mentioned. If it would have said like Ramses II, the pharaoh, we would have been able to say, all right, probably even close to like 50 years approximation if it happened exactly then, but there was no name. So thus the questions.
Beautiful, yeah. That's pretty much all there is on it, and then the rest is just the rabbit holes for each of the theories, so there's that. Okay, I fixed the problem that we had, I think, right? Are we ready to show it? So here's what we want to do. We want to actually, at the beginning, we wanted you to watch an overview by Bible Project. The guy behind it is the guy we got to spend a week with preparing for Exodus series. And so they do these beautiful animations of each book of the Bible. So before reading a book of the Bible, you'd be wise to go and watch a Bible Project video just to grasp an overall picture. And so they're going to try and get it up on the screen. And there's 2 parts to it, so enjoy the videos. This will kind of help you get back into what the book of Exodus is all about and kind of see the whole overview.
Book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family in a famine. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now, that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now, Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with a final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the son spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son, and he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind, and he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites, they're trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. I mean, it's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 through 18, which tell the foundational story of how God rescued the enslaved Israelites by confronting and defeating Pharaoh, while offering.
The first half of the book of Exodus tells the story of ancient Israel being rescued from slavery. And when people say the Exodus story, those are the chapters they're referring to.
But the book has a second half where Moses gives the 10 Commandments to Israel along with these instructions about building a sacred tent.
And what links these two halves together is this crucial story. The people of Israel, they're out in the middle of nowhere. They find themselves at the foot of this mountain called Sinai. And here, God's presence comes dramatically down in the form of a violent storm cloud.
Now let's stop a second and talk about this concept of God's presence, because it's really important for the rest of the book. At the beginning of the Bible, in the Garden of Eden, humanity was in God's presence. They had this close relationship with him, and it was good. But humanity rebels, and the relationship is fractured, and access to God's presence is lost. But God promised Abraham that he would restore his blessing to all of the nations, and that includes this restoration of relationship and access to God's presence.
So here at Sinai, God's presence is now right here in front of them, and it's actually quite frightening. And he's here to invite Israel into this unique and close relationship with him.
And the word used to describe this relationship is covenant. It's like a legal agreement between God and Israel. And it's unique because up till now, God hasn't asked Israel to do anything in return, just to trust him. But here on this mountain, God is going to ask Israel to do something. A lot of things, actually. He gives them a whole set of laws. It includes the 10 Commandments. And if they obey these commandments, they will become the people who will represent God to the nations of the world.
Like a priest would.
Yeah, in fact, that's what God calls them to become, a kingdom of priests. And this is all connected back to the promise to Abraham that his family would become a blessing to the nations.
Okay, but obeying these laws is going to be difficult because there's a lot of them, and they set a really high standard.
Though if you think about it, I mean, of anybody in the world who should be able to do it, I mean, it's these people who experienced firsthand God's grace and his power when he rescued them from slavery.
And they agree to obey the terms, but then they refuse to go into God's presence because it's still a bit frightening.
And since the people won't go up, Moses goes up to the mountain by himself to meet with God. But God still wants to be with all of his people. And so he says, okay, if the people won't come up here to me, I'll come down off this mountain to be with you all. And that's why he orders Moses to build this elaborate tent as a place where God's presence can be among his people.
And that's why the next thing we get is 7 chapters of extremely detailed architectural blueprints for this tent. It's really, really long.
But every detail is important and has some kind of symbolic value. For example, there's all this Garden of Eden imagery inside the tent. And it's to remind you that when you're in the tent, you are in God's presence.
Then we get another 6 chapters describing how they built the tent, which is really just repeating the same blueprints word for word.
Now let's back up, because before the tent is finished, there's this super important story. Moses is coming off the mountain with the 10 Commandments and the blueprints in his hands, and he finds Israel breaking the first 2 commands of the covenant.
Don't have any other gods before me, and don't worship idol statues.
Right, and so here we are. Immediately after agreeing to the covenant, they're throwing this ritual party. They're worshiping an idol. And so God says to Moses, you know what? This is not going to work. I should just wipe these people out and start over with you.
But Moses reminds God of his promise to Abraham and pleads with God to spare them, which is a really weird conversation. Why would God need to be reminded of something?
Yeah, it does seem odd, but this dialogue is inviting us into God's experience of grief and pain due to Israel's actions, and he really could walk away. But instead, this God chooses faithfulness to his own promises, even though he knows it's going to cost him.
So we come to the end of the book. The tabernacle's built, God's presence comes down off the mountain to fill it, and in the final scene, Moses goes to enter the tabernacle to be in God's presence.
But he can't. He's actually not able to go inside, and that's how the book ends.
Why can't he go in? That was the whole point.
So when Israel worshipped the golden calf, it was like a slap in the face to God's faithfulness. And so Moses can't just waltz into the tent like everything's just fine. There's a deeper problem still in this relationship.
Will they ever be able to fix the relationship and go into God's presence?
Well, that's what the next book, Leviticus, is all about.
Hey, this is John.
And this is Tim.
We believe the Bible is one long story, and so we...
Okay, So what you got to see there is actually two different parts from two different series. And they have more than this. They've got videos, for example, when we went through the name of God, God is gracious, compassionate. They'll go through each of the word and have a separate 5-minute video around it and sort of tying in all the themes together. So an advertisement recommendation of the resource, which, like I said, you'll be wise to go to. So we'll begin with our first question then, or first non-historical or nerdy questions. Let's see, this one is about chapter 4, verses 26, which I'll read, 24 through 26. If you want to follow along. Chapter 4, verse 24. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah, his wife, took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. And she said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So the Lord let him alone. At that time she said, "bridegroom of blood," referring to circumcision. And the question is, why did God want to kill Moses, and what's going on with this bizarre part of Exodus that you guys did not preach through?
I really like this one because I had the opportunity to listen to a really good teaching on this, and so I just want to share with you what I learned, because this is one of those strange passages of scripture that you were talking about earlier, where what do we do with these scriptures when we don't understand them, or they're kind of weird, and and that's kind of what we're seeing here. And so I just want to encourage you that when you encounter these type of passages, again, that you would just sit with it long enough to see what God has to say about his character, because I guarantee you God's character is always good. So in this setting, God has just commissioned Moses. He has said, "I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to do these great acts that I'm going to do through you. I'm going to kill the firstborn son of Pharaoh, and I'm commissioning you, and you will know that I am Yahweh, and they will know that I am Yahweh." And then all of a sudden he leaves, and there's this passage about God going after him to kill him. And so why is that? Why do we see this scripture going on here? And what's really happening here? So, and there's a lot of ambiguity also in this scripture. And so over the course of time when people have been studying this, it's not been super clear. But as people have really dove into the culture, there's some good theories about what they think this represents. And so first off, it says that he met Moses and was trying to kill him. And it's like, who is him? Is it Moses? Is it Gershom, his son? And why is Moses passive in the story? And why does Sophia have to come in and circumcise her son? And what's really going on in this picture? So one of the things to think about is what we know of Moses so far. And what we know about Moses is he was hidden in the reeds by his parents to save his life. He was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised as an educated, upper-class Egyptian, but he knew he was Hebrew, and he had compassion for his fellow man, to the point that he actually ended up committing manslaughter and then having to flee from the Egyptians because he had committed murder. And so I think it's probably pretty safe to say that Moses was having a bit of an identity crisis, right? Is he Egyptian or is he Hebrew, right? And kind of like, who am I, is probably, part of what Moses is going through at this point. And so then we see this whole thing about circumcision and why the circumcision. So Egyptians would have been circumcised. It is part of their culture as well. And so both Hebrews and Egyptians would have been circumcised. So Moses was circumcised, but his son was not. And I personally think that this going to kill him was referring to Gershom, his son, because that's who they circumcise. And that's what appeases God. And so I think this is really fascinating. There is a parallel between the blood of the Passover lamb that saves the people in the plague, right? So if you put the blood over your door, the Spirit of God would pass over you and spare the life of your firstborn son. And so it's the blood that gives a protective covering. And then you have this circumcision, and she cuts the foreskin off her son, and she takes the bloody foreskin and she touches it to, we don't know if it's Moses or Gershom, but we think Moses touches Moses and says, "You're a bridegroom of blood to me." And so again, you see, and God is appeased. So again, you see that there is a shedding of blood that happens that is protective for this son, and that appeases God. So there's an interesting parallel there. And another thing to a point that's made is that for Moses, who even the people would probably be going, is he Hebrew or is he Egyptian, right? For Moses to lead the covenant people out of exile, not only would he have to be circumcised, but his son would have to be circumcised. So there's an element of, is this an issue of obedience, that Moses was supposed to circumcise his son and didn't, and this was God's retribution because he was disobedient? But I think that's the picture is somewhat identifying of who Moses is. So in order for Moses to really be on board as a Hebrew and not an Egyptian, to lead the Hebrews as a covenant member himself, he would have needed to have his son circumcised. And so when Zipporah circumcises the son, she says, "You are a bridegroom or a kinsman." The actual language there is, "You're a kinsman of blood to me." And the thought is, the argument there is that she's saying, "You are a kinsman," meaning Yahweh, "you are a kinsman of blood to me," that she is now saying, we are part of this covenant. So there would be a very clear commission of Moses. His family would be, the sons and the males would be circumcised. He would be part of the tribe to lead them out. And it's like Zipporah is saying, we're in on this. We belong with this covenant. And so there's a really interesting piece there. And I think it's also part of God cementing Moses' identity. And with that, I just wanted to throw this one last thing out. When I was listening to this sermon, I got the picture of, and maybe this is really my generation, but in the really old movies of cowboys and Indians, when there was a merging of a family between the cowboy and the Indian, you often saw this dramatic, the cowboy would cut his arm and the Indian would cut his arm, and they'd put their arms together and they'd become blood brothers, right? And it was the blood that joined them. And that was sort of the picture I got. Like, so now we're brothers and we are together in a covenant. And that's sort of the picture I'm getting of her. We belong in this covenant, and Moses' identity would be with the Israelites. That's what I got out of that.
I'll add one thing. I mean, that's a really good answer, and I hate to. I want to just leave it at that, but there's also another perspective that I just want to share really quickly, and it's this idea that, where we read here that God sought to kill Moses, in Hebrew, that sought to kill is the same exact wording that was used at the beginning of Exodus, where it says the Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. And so there's this idea that, and I remember when I was sharing the first sermon, there was this idea that sin has consequences. And so, it happened long ago, but there's still consequence for that sin. And so, as Moses being commissioned for this kind of holy mission of bringing out the people out of the land of Egypt, but he has the sin in his life that still hasn't been dealt with. And so kind of how you brought about that the sin covers, and so that's what another application of that is, where Moses, in this case, is being redeemed before Israel is being redeemed. Moses gets redeemed from his sin through that blood. And so also another reflection of the blood of Jesus. That's what everything is pointing to, is in the end that Jesus took our sin upon himself. On that cross, he shed his blood that covered our sin and gave us that restoration and peace with God.
It also shows that Moses was human, right? And that this wasn't this majestic leader that had everything figured out, but clearly this was an act of disobedience in a way. I know this part, there's only 3 verses as far as I know that talk about this situation and no other context around it, but there's some disobedience. I think God would have communicated to Moses that this circumcision should have happened. It didn't, so Moses is doing things wrong and he's disobedient. And God, he's not just saying, Moses, you're my favorite one, I'm going to let you slide. But he's saying, hey, just as I'm going to be hard on the people of Israel to follow this covenant, same with you. If you're going to lead them, you have to also be part of this covenant with me, which I think is interesting.
Cool. Got to move on to the next question. Why did God kill the firstborn of the Egyptians, not giving them a way to save their children? Right, so if you remember, the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. And so the question was about, why didn't have a way?
Well, he didn't. Why did God kill all the firstborn Egyptians? He didn't. So the Egyptians were afforded the same protection as the Jews. If they put the blood over the door frames, they would be saved. And in addition to that, when the Israelites did leave, there were actually Egyptians that left with them. So there were other people that saw that Yahweh was the Lord, and they went with the Israelites.
The idea is that they had 9 plagues before even coming to the 10th plague to the gods of Egypt or the one that's really challenging the world.
Yeah, just to add, that is true. Yeah, they did have a chance to do that. So I don't know. I don't believe for the 10th plague it explicitly calls that out that any of the Egyptians did, but we know it's so because I think it was the 7th plague where with the hail. If we read there, it says that. When Moses had said, bring in, because, all your cattle, your slave, they're going to be destroyed by this hail, it does say that there were Egyptians who had heard of this, and those who had listened to the warnings of God, they brought in their slaves. They brought in their all their cattle and all their farm animals inside to protect them from the hail. So there were Egyptians that believed that these things would happen, and they did heed to the words of God, and so I think with the 10th plague there's probably a similar thing where they did hear about it and they applied the blood of the lamb on their doorpost.
Yeah, it actually gets a bit more interesting because I think in what you're bringing up in Exodus 9:18, God specifically tells Moses to go to the Pharaoh and warn the Egyptians of this hail. So in 9:18 it says, therefore at this time tomorrow I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring in your livestock and everything you have in field to place of shelter. So he's telling them, hey, this is going to be the worst hailstorm. Hide your cattle. I'm warning you. Trust me. So God is giving them an opportunity to step into this relationship with them even before this 10th plague. So I'm assuming that those that believed, and there were people that did that, like it says in verse 20, those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. So assuming that some people actually stayed and might have even participated in the Passover because they built that trust early on. But I think ultimately, another perspective that I wanted to touch on is asking this question, why did God kill all the firstborn of the Egyptians? I feel like the root question would be, why is God evil? Why is God punishing the Egyptians or killing the Egyptians when realistically, looking at the history for 100+ years, these Israelites were persecuted. Their kids were publicly executed. You know, there's so much cruelty that went on that God put up with. And now finally, after so many years of being patient with them, he is now protecting his people. You know, a real example that's closer to our time would be, you know, the Nazi guards in a camp like Auschwitz, right? If they did horrible things. They starved people, they beat them, they're participants in, you know, these very evil things. And if you think about it, well, how did other people respond to when the war was over to these guards? They responded pretty badly with them. They did terrible things to them. So in a sense, it's where I'm going with this is God had the full authority to respond and to protect his own people. And I feel like we would, as people, do the same if we were put in that position as people did in World War II. However, like Joyce said, like Stan said, God gave plenty of time, and he also gave the Egyptians the opportunity to be saved as well.
Yep. Good. All right. You can ask more about that, but we'll move on. Maybe I'll just, okay, one thing I'll say is that there is still a, it's not to say that there isn't a tension left there with the killing of the firstborn in particular, because babies as they are pretty vulnerable, right? And so we still have to hold that tension that this wasn't, yes, God provided the way, and that's the important kind of point of the story, but the situation itself still should make us a bit uncomfortable, right? Because these were babies after all, right? Who really didn't get to do much in this world yet. And so, again, it's God's justice coming slowly. But then again, he's the creator. He's the one who set the world in motion, and he has the right to take a life or give a life.
God always provides a way too, right? So like, I think sometimes it's a heart issue. So we saw in the wilderness when the snakes came and they were biting, and all you had to do was look at the staff that Moses made and you'd be saved, and people still didn't look. You know, people still died because they refused to just turn their head and look. And so, you know, sometimes it's really a heart issue that we're maybe not seeing the total picture, because God always provides a way.
Yep. All right, here's another question. If law was a marriage covenant with people of Israel, how then God killed plenty of people for disobeying the covenant? The idea here is this: if this is a marriage analogy, then does God mean that God's covenant was for Israel as a people rather than a covenant with each person? As in, he worked through the issues with the people as a whole, but was fine with killing people here and there. So is it a community, or is it individual, or is it both, or how do they play together? Anyone?
Yeah, this is my question, so I feel like I can't answer it.
Yeah, so with this one, I don't know if we have the answers to all portions of that. But it's also, I think it's important to point out, you know, I remember Alex preaching on this, and he brought this example of that it is like a marriage covenant. But I think when we're looking at it with questions like this, I don't think that calling it a marriage covenant is entirely a correct kind of comparison, because a marriage covenant would be, you know, two equal or similar parts coming together in an agreement, but God and the people of Israel are not two equals. And so I think it's important when looking at it to make that distinction, that God is holy and sovereign, and the people of Israel are just broken, sinful people.
And he's the only keeper of the covenant. Good, yeah.
So with covenants in the Old Testament times, what you'd have is you know, they would draw out the covenants on tablets like they did, and they put one tablet in this person's temple, you know, and then the person that they had the covenant with, maybe they'd put that a copy of the covenant, right, in the other person's God's temple, and it was sort of like, my God's going to watch you and make sure that you fulfill your covenant, and your God's going to watch me and make sure I fulfill my end of the covenant. But God, when Moses came down off the mountain, he had 2 copies, right, and they both went into the Ark of the Covenant, and they both went into the Holy of Holies. And so because God would be the only person who could make sure that he was going to, keep his end of the bargain, right? And he did. God fulfilled his covenant. It's Israel that kept breaking it and breaking it and breaking it. And so there were consequences that they had to face because of their sin.
And in the relation to the question of covenant versus individuals, here's Dr. Carmen Joy Imes on this point. She says, like it or not, that's what happens when one member of a company or a sports team, a club, or a faith community behaves badly. Meaning there is no private sin when it's a covenant with a community. It reflects on the entire group and what they represent. There is no such thing as private sin. What we do matters, not just to us, but to everyone on our team. And with Israel, the problem is even more serious than guilt by association, because the whole nation collectively entered into a covenant with Yahweh. One person's unfaithfulness puts everyone at risk of punishment by defiling the land. It was all for one and one for all, essentially. And then another guy was commenting, saying that the Israelites' conception of itself as a community bound by God, to God by a covenant, by collectively responsible for its action. By a covenant has dual implications. Society is collectively responsible for its actions, and the individual too is accountable for behavior that affects the life of community. Again, that's more from a Jewish perspective. And so the idea is that it's they are as a community before him, and because they were all pointing to Jesus when he would one day come, in order for them to be that representation, the priestly nation, the holy priesthood to all around them, they needed to live as a community. And that means that each individual looked up to that common goal. And once one deviated, that was a risk to the whole community. And so God had to deal individually, precisely, surgically with each person, but for the sake of the greater community. Here's another one. Exodus 34:20. What did God mean by commanding the Israelites to redeem the firstborn donkey with a lamb, but requiring the neck to be broken if it was left unredeemed? And what did this redemption and severe judgment symbolize? Thanks for submitting that question. Short on this one. Anybody? You guys know what we're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, this is again, one of those passages where it's like you're reading and it's like, yeah, that makes sense, and then you get to one verse and it's like, what? Yeah, this is interesting. I don't know, again, I'll take my best shot and maybe someone else could fill in. But donkeys were part of this unclean group of animals, and I don't know if it specifically applied to donkeys only, but it was talking about how every firstborn in the kingdom or the nation of Israel belonged to God, regardless of human or animal. And so just as the humans required that redemption, that blood on the doorpost for that firstborn to be redeemed, so do the animals. And so, this firstborn, it belonged to God. And so if you were to use it and have it as your own and use it in your field or for your own profit or possession, then it was kind of like a buying it back from God, redeeming it and kind of dedicating for service. And if it wasn't, then it kind of brutally put, where you break its neck, you end its life as this is God's, and if you're not going to pay for it, then you can't have it.
Yeah, I think you covered it really well. The other point that I don't know if you guys found the same thing, but what I found in my studies are that all the clean animals, right, there's the unclean and clean. All the clean animals, the firstborn, there was no substitution. You just had to sacrifice that animal. So in a sense, the first animal sacrifice was saying, God, thank you for everything that you've done for us, and this is us giving our firstborn, whatever that is, lamb, the clean animals, we thank you. Now with the unclean animals, you can't do the same thing. You're required to give that animal to God as a thank you. But instead of giving that animal because it's unclean to God, you then take a lamb, in a sense, substituting for that unclean animal that's not able to be sacrificed. And there's a lot of imagery to the New Testament in that, right? Us, people who can't, who have sin, who can't be sacrificed, we're unclean, we would not be worthy. But then Jesus comes in, and he's the sacrificial lamb that then dies for our sins so that we can then live as this unclean donkey. You heard it here first.
I know Alex said quick, but one other thing that kind of comes up in mind when I'm reading over this and reading this is like, okay, but why does the first one belong to God? Like, those are my animals. I'm raising them. I'm taking care of them. Okay, I get it. My first son belongs to God. Maybe there's some symbolic thing there, but even the animals, like, God, give me at least something. And so, but that's the covenant they entered with God. He brought them out of Egypt. They were in bondage and slavery there. They had no freedom, but God brought them out. He loved them, and he's giving them this land, this abundance, and in that covenant, that's kind of their obligation, or what he's asking of them is like, this firstborn, this one's going to be mine.
It's like a tithe, right? So like it's the firstborn, it's the first, it's the very first ones, right?
The thing is, we live on the other side of Eden. So our griping with God, like, why is it like this now, has to do a lot with ourselves. We got ourselves into this mess, right? Garden of Eden, things would have been quite different if we stayed under God's reign and co-reigned with him as we nurtured the world that he has gifted us. However, we took things in our own hands, and so obviously we're now living in a world where we are both forgetful and we are prone to continually walk away from him. So when you look at this, it might seem strange, like, hold on, what's going on? Are you saying that they bring the animal to the temple? But the thing is, you got to know that part of it was a sacrifice ritual, and I think part of it is to train us to put our attention on God and learn to give something up. But keep in mind, they didn't just, some were fully burnt, which also has a sense, but a lot of them were just eaten. This was food that the priest would then later eat. I mean, we're talking about a steak, bringing a steak so that it would be both offered to God as a thank you for blessing us as a people, and then at the end, the priests and the Levites would have a go at it and share it with their families. And so keep that in mind. That's why probably donkey wasn't, a thing that they were going to eat. So instead, you'd bring a sheep. Just sort of the human side of that. Again, we're kind of distanced by time, but that's, it's pretty normal in the society of the day.
One of the things I would want to point out as well is that, so while this, this killing of the donkey is, pointing to the destruction, the cost of sin, right? The cost of the sin and sort of our position before God and his holiness. One thing that it also shows is actually, this is very loving, because it says that all firstborn animals and humans belong to God. But this was the only religion this is the only God that it was forbidden to do human sacrifice. So where other religions would be like, yeah, give me your firstborn, throw them on the fire, this didn't happen with our God. God saw that as abhorrent. He didn't want humanity destroyed that way. And so even though the firstborn child, right, belonged to God, he made a way to sacrifice, a lamb instead of your child, because that would be sinning.
Yep. So a similar question then is, what do we do with again, you were supposed to read Exodus and then find parts that are weird, right, and submit them. Here's one of them. Exodus 34:26. It says not to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And the question was, what's the purpose, meaning behind it, and does it apply to Christians today?
One of the things I saw as I did some research on that question was that this was a strict dietary law that appears 3 times in the Torah, and the Jews have expanded this law. And so they have maybe perhaps didn't understand it, and so to make sure they don't sin, they made it more and more and more. And so that was kind of interesting. But one of the scholars that I was reading believed that this was a direct prohibition against adopting pagan fertility rites practiced by surrounding Canaanite tribes who may have used magic charms to ensure better harvests and stuff like that. So there's was an element of perhaps maybe not adopting Canaanite rituals was maybe a part of it, but they don't really know.
They probably sat and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Remember doing that in Canaan or whatever.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on maybe another viewpoint of this, and then I'll let somebody else talk about the New Testament application. But it's actually really funny because I was listening to a podcast, and these gentlemen were talking about Israel and the food that you can find there. And basically, they've taken this law so far that you can't mix any meat with dairy based on these verses. So if you go to Israel, you can't find a cheeseburger. You can find cheese on the side, you can find a burger, or you can find the meat. In pizza, you can have a meat pizza and you could have a cheese pizza, but you can't have meat and cheese on one pizza because, you know, they point back to this law saying that you don't mix dairy and meat. So just to give a bit of an example to that. But another perspective we can look at of why maybe this rule exists is that there's just a lot of, I feel like God, in the rules that he's giving Israel, he is kind of telling his organization and how he likes things. He likes clean and he likes unclean. You know, whenever you eat an animal, you have to drain all of its blood out so that there's no blood mixed into it. So it's kind of like saying there's life and death. So it's kind of like you're mixing life and death together in this pot, which is a bit unclean, I think, which could also be a different perspective with the pagan rituals as well, being like fertility and all of that.
You're going to have to pick up the New Testament part, but I was just going to say that in Jewish culture, by explaining prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk, it was an effort, I'm quoting Dr. Rushban, a Jewish scholar. He says it was an effort to teach civilized behavior and demonstrate compassion. So more to like just the, you know, if we're not going into the cults and rites, it's just to demonstrate compassion and civilized behavior. There you go. But to New Testament, I don't know if you meant by this that we're not bound by, I hope you guys know this, we're not bound by dietary restrictions of Leviticus or the Pentateuch altogether, like the first five books of the Bible. That doesn't mean that there might not be some wisdom and principles, and so just because we're not bound by it, it doesn't, like, you know, for example, eating pork, you probably can enjoy pork, but you also at this point know that from a medical perspective that pork is not maybe the healthiest meat to consume. So again, we're not bound by it, but you know, use wisdom because they were given to an ancient civilization living in a different time in a different, you know, world for the specific purpose for them to be a separate nation, whether it be for health reasons or to be distinct until the Messiah arrives.
And there were three types of laws. There were dietary laws, ritual laws for the temple, and moral laws. And I believe we're still bound to the moral laws. We're just not bound to the ritual or the dietary laws.
Or the dietary, yeah, ceremonial.
One final comment. Reading that, it just sounds like it makes sense. Like, that just sounds cruel, right? Like taking a baby, boiling it in its mother's milk. That just like, I don't know why, but to me, I would, even not bound by that law, I would say, if I was running a farm, I'd say I wouldn't do that. So it kind of made sense to me. I didn't even question it until this question was asked. I'm like, okay. But the New Testament verse, I think, Alex, you did a really good job at explaining it, but just one thing, Mark 7:19. This is where a lot of people and scholars say that Jesus declared all foods clean. And it says, for it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. And then in parentheses, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. This is the ESV version. So kind of adding on to that Jesus himself said, what goes into your body doesn't make you clean or unclean, but it's what is in your heart. Basically, that's what we focus on.
Okay, if nothing else, I got two more. I'm skipping one, and I got two more. I'm skipping one because I know who wrote that, and we're good. Exodus 35, verse 3, why was Israel not allowed by God to kindle fire in any of their places of habitation on the Sabbath day. And then one more after this, and then we'll open it up.
It's work.
Okay, moving
Pretty
on
much
to the
what it
next
comes.
question.
Yeah. They're not allowed to work on Sabbath, and it's just interesting where fire was kind of has this correlation to the creation of earth, where God had created light, and so when God had created that was on one of those days of work, and so to them, creating something as simple as fire was it was work, and so they were supposed to rest. And it's interesting because this command is also given, right at the same time when God commissions them to build the temple. And so it's kind of this interesting thing where, he's telling them to rest. And so they can't even make a fire. That is, you might think, well, it's urgent. We need to build this temple. We need to make this dwelling place for God. But, something as simple as even fire, God is saying, no, rest. This day, don't do anything.
I kind of like, this is the female perspective here. I also kind of like that this would be protective of women. Think about the women. If there was no fire, you couldn't cook, you couldn't maybe you couldn't clean a pot because you couldn't boil water, whatever it is. It was also so that the women could have their, Shabbat. They could have their rest as well.
Yep. Thank you. So if you have a question, there'll be a spot after this last question to ask them. Hopefully you do at least one. If not, that's totally fine. But as you can see, we tried to take them. I mean, it's easy to prepare ahead of time, so you can throw a question at us and test us how we are without preparation. But here's the last one. Why did God use Old Testament people as an example for coming generations? It says so in Hebrews, I think, and then Paul mentions it in Corinthians. Are human beings used like pawns for some greater purpose? As in like in Exodus, where they used just like as pawns for the greater purpose of Jesus coming or the church?
Yeah, for me, I think reading those verses, and I found them, and I'll try to read them, but I just interpret them a bit differently. So 1 Corinthians 10:11, these things happened to them, talking about the people of Israel, as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. And then Romans 15:4, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. So for me, I don't read it as God purposely had the goal of marching these people through the desert so that they would be in pain as pawns, just so we would read back on it and say, oh wow, look at these people, and I'm so thankful where I'm at. But I think the way that I read it is they all had agency. People act freely, and so they're morally accountable. And of course, people that are flawed are going to run into issues. And then all of this was written down for our example. So in a sense, the reason that we're reading about it so that we can learn from it, rather than it was purposely like a puppeteer doing this purposely for us, but rather it happened, but then it was written down for us so that we could learn from it. That's how I understand those verses.
Yeah, in my mind, a pawn is like on a chessboard. It doesn't have free will. It's just going to go where you set it and where you want it to go. But, we as humans, we have free will. And so all the things that we read in the Old Testament, this was people doing things. And one interesting phrase is when we read about Joseph in Genesis, his brothers gave him up into slavery. And, when he meets his brothers again, he says that, what you meant for evil against me, God meant for good. God didn't make his brothers put him into slavery. That's something they did on his own will. God didn't make them do that so then, the Israelites ended up in Egypt and then they could go through this exodus. No, I don't think God was, as Paul was saying, puppeteering them to do that. But, people have their own free will, and God is outside of time, and he knows what people will do. And so he's able to use those situations for the greater good.
Well, then doesn't that all give us meaning? Like when I look back over the time, different aspects of my life and different times when it's been hard, I cling to some of those things as this is what built my faith. I went through this really horrible thing over here, and God did this. And then I went through this really hard thing over here, and God did this. And it brings me back to the beginning of Exodus where, God says, like the people were in slavery and they moaned, and God heard and saw and remembered his covenant and knew. Like that, he's looking at his people going, I want to rescue you. And their prayers rose up and God heard them. And the difficult times in my life, like that verse you read, if you guys haven't read Romans 15:4 recently, read it and memorize it. It's such a good verse about, these are the things that will teach us, and the endurance the scriptures provide us and are examples to us do help us and do encourage us and buoy us up during hard times.
All right, so hopefully that answers that question. And now, if you do have a question, we'd love to take it. You could just shout it without a mic, and I'll repeat it. Thank you. So the question is, Exodus 40 ends with Moses not being able to go into God's presence anymore since they finished building the tabernacle, and is there a difference between him being in the presence of God before versus after? Anybody?
If I'm remembering correctly, and I could be wrong, but I think that the sacrifice hasn't happened yet. So I think when Moses can't go in, don't they have to make a sacrifice first? And then once the sacrifice is complete, the atonement as sin has happened, then he's able to go in. But I'm not 100% sure if I'm remembering that correctly. Okay.
Yeah, so the cool part, this is the cool part about Leviticus, and again, there's a superb literary design to the book, to the the first 5 books of the Bible, that to a English reader are not always evident. When you read it in Hebrew, or when you're actually starting to realize the patterns in which the way that it's built, then it kind of moves as a story. And the beautiful part about it is, you're right, it ends with him not being able to enter into the presence. And so in the middle you have Leviticus, which is all the laws and rituals specifically. It's not that this book necessarily is doing much of an action, although there is more towards the end. It's like, well, here's what's required for the holy God to dwell among you and for you to be his people. If you look at Numbers, which is the following book after Leviticus, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting now. Now he's inside. And so Leviticus is necessary in between as a way now to go forward. Now that they've built the tabernacle. So there is a bit of it's almost like the presence of God, and it was provisional for Moses before they entered into the covenant. And now that they entered into the covenant, the invitation is for Moses and everybody else to come into the presence of God, being his holy people. Leviticus is really fun. I don't think it would be wise to do teaching series on it, although maybe. But it's like, I know it's the most boring book in the Bible, but I remember when I studied it for the first time of like, oh, this is actually interesting, like the reasons why, rather than just throwing it out as a boring list of rules that don't apply to us, God's holiness in it, and then Jesus's analogies in the New Testament are kind of become alive in the book of Leviticus. Also, I would say this, now that you've read this, go read Hebrews in the New Testament. Now that we've gone through the book of Exodus, as you read Hebrews, it probably will just look a little bit different all of a sudden because you walk through Exodus. Anything else? Any other questions? Yeah.
I know Igor has a question. I know he's just too afraid to ask.
Easy one, please.
When I was reading towards the end there are things that God tells them to set apart. Like, here are the utensils, and here is this, and they are to be holy and set apart. And also, like in the New Testament, we'll find when Peter, I'm not sure if it's parallel to these areas, but like when Peter addresses, I'll try to read this. This is 1 Peter, verse from verse 13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passion of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father, who judges immediately, according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. So here it brings out the questions of being holy, like being set apart. And we find that there's like this allegory, right, that's happening with utensils and certain things to be set apart and treated differently. Can you elaborate on holiness, like how we are to apply these things that are being set apart as Christians today?
Okay. Please. So in the Old Testament, to be set apart was largely, well, okay, so God gave him a lot of laws to set him apart, right? And the purpose of that has always been justice and holiness and worship and social protection and setting Israel apart from surrounding nations. So for them, it was not just morally, it was also in the way that they it touched on every aspect of their life, if you will. And there was a particular way for them as a nation to look differently. Now, when Jesus comes around, he is the Holy One. He is the one in whom we now gain our identity. And he comes to redeem not just one particular, he doesn't come to create one particular culture that is set apart visually in the way that we dress or do our meals or whatever. He comes to redeem the whole world, which means in the context of whatever culture that you're in. And so when it comes to the word holy and God being holy, all that is that there is no evil in him, right? That's what his holiness is that he is apart from anything that is wrong in the world. And so for us, the command, or I think it's Peter then who says, he repeats it, I think later, he says, now God is, be holy as I am holy. He quotes actually from Leviticus, if I'm not mistaken. The invitation for us to become like God is less about that we have parts of our life that are set apart in a certain way, that we look different in ways, but that our life is consecrated to him, that the whole of our life, whatever it may be, rather than just styles, but how we breathe and walk and how we make decisions and how we live, that we become more and more like Jesus, in whom we now find our identity. And so it is probably more spiritual than it is physical. And if the spiritual part is right, then it transforms your outside as well, meaning how people perceive you and how you go about in the world. I guess that's the best I can do on the spot, me personally.
And if we look at the law and the Torah, there was a particular cultural context that God was using to reveal his character. And we need to think about what it looks like to demonstrate the righteousness and the faithfulness of God in our cultural context and in the light of how Jesus reshapes our connection with the law, right? So we're no longer under the law, but God also says faith without works is dead, right? So there's that doctrine of sanctification, that we receive our holiness through Christ, but then we're working out our being holy, right? Like, so we're working out our salvation, we're working out our we don't, it's not a free pass to just sin whenever you want. It's not a free pass to go, oh, well, I can just confess it to God, so I can do whatever I want on Saturday, and I'll just say I'm sorry Sunday morning. There's an element of working out your sanctification in Christ, but looking at how the law kind of shapes our culture today.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think verse 14 kind of explains it to me. It says, don't slip back into your old ways of living to satisfy your own desires. So in a sense, living unholy would be thinking only about the physical, thinking about fleshly desires, thinking about your own self. But being holy isn't necessarily, as I understand it, that means you're going to be perfect and sinless, but rather that now you're thinking about the spiritual things, and you are now trying to get closer to God, trying to imitate Jesus, trying to invest in the spiritual, which through that you are choosing to be set apart from this world, and you are then choosing the holy path of walking down the spiritual path. That's what makes sense to me.
I might just repeat everything everyone else just said, but I'll take the verse right after the one Paul just read, where it says, "Be holy, because I am holy." And Alex started by underlining that He's the one that makes us holy. He was that perfect holiness, and so kind of underline the significance and why the course we did last year of practicing the way and this idea of becoming. We want to become like Him. We want to resemble Him. And so by doing these things, we grow closer to Him. And as it says, be like me, be holy. And so I think we grow in that. And yeah, we just become like
That's a good point. I think we're wrapping up here, so no more questions. You probably are like, what is going on? 6:46 already. I do have one more question for them, which I'll ask right now, but let me just tie it up with this, is that keep in mind that we live in a contemporary world where we are peaceful, everything's great, you could go on to have a great life here, right? Like with or without Jesus, it seems like. But God calls church to be a distinct people, just the same that it was with the people of Israel. I mean, He calls us to be the new creation made in Him right now, even as we live in the middle of a world that still pulls us one way or another, either by our own desires or by the devil or the world. We're still being torn apart. But this is the good news, is that we are to become like Him. That's essentially what Peter is saying here, is that our goal from now on is to spend time with Jesus, with the Word, not just with the Scriptures, but the Word Himself, Jesus Himself, who has tabernacled among us, as John would say in chapter 1, and to become like Him. And this tension between who we were and who we are becoming is where the whole of spiritual life is happening, right? Like we want to become more like Him. We want to imitate His holiness. We want to be set apart just like Him. And so, yeah, becoming is the goal of life. Here's my final question to you guys, and I can chime in as well. What is a challenging part of Exodus for you? Like when you're reflecting on, going through this whole thing, how did I have it phrased here? What parts of Exodus you struggle to understand or are still challenging to you, if you don't mind sharing, so that you could see that we're also human?
For me, I think it's the intricacies of some of the laws, because we're so far removed from that time. It's really hard to look back and know exactly what the situation was like, what this meant, whether this was an extreme on purpose or whether this was a part of daily life. For example, depending on the day and how much coffee I had, probably an explanation to this, I would fumble really hard. But Exodus 21:20, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. So that, I'm surprised nobody has asked that question. I'm glad nobody did. But that is difficult. I mean, you can talk about slavery as in, it could have been different back then. And today, technically, I would be a slave to the CEO of my company in a different way where, he's a nice CEO. He doesn't hit me. He doesn't punish me. He doesn't take away my pay, my planned leave, whatever that is. But So I could understand that part, but the beating part, and if the slave survives, then it's okay. I mean, I know I could bring up a lot of other, like eye for an eye and the fairness of the law, but like I said, if I didn't have enough coffee that day, I'd probably fumble the answer to that.
For me, I think I want to believe, I believe that God is intimately involved in my life. But I also, I struggle with the big picture. So I was really getting this year, through this study, and I was really getting the big picture piece that I love of the story of redemption being repeated in different ways through the whole Bible, that it's a continuous story. I loved that. What I struggle with is kind of knowing, okay, God, what's my role in that? I believe that you want to be intimately involved in my life and that you are speaking to me and that you are intimate. But, you know, the Israelites were in exile and in slavery for 400 years. And I think, there were people that died in slavery. They were born in slavery and they died in slavery. And that part is hard for me because I think, well, I'm sure they felt like, hey, Yahweh is our God and he, is all powerful, and that, and yet they lived and died in slavery. So sometimes I have a hard time struggling through the overarching God's plan in the universe versus God's plan in my life and his involvement in my personal life. And sometimes I struggle with that.
I wish I answered before you, because I resonate with that. And there's a discussion we kind of touched on Friday in the small group, and it's, I had kind of shared where, sometimes we look at the Old Testament and we look at the New Testament, or in our lives, and it's like, oh, that looks like a different God, but we read in Exodus, and God describes himself as this kind God, as this loving God, and sometimes it might not seem like that to us because, we're reading, you could probably get through the Old Testament in a few days if you really tried, and you're reading through 2,000 years of history, and then you want the same amount of things to happen in your life in the 60 years you live here. And so that's me sometimes. I kind of feel like, oh God, you were doing so much then, people saw and you were directly enacting in their life, and sometimes it feels like you're not right here nearby me. And so I resemble with that where, but there were those people, and there's a lot of details that aren't written about in Exodus or a lot of those books about just the mundane lives of people. And so I don't know if it's as much of a struggle as just something that I have to constantly remind myself as I read through these books.
Thank you. And I'll share mine in a second. As we dismiss the team here, would you give them up? Would you applaud, please? Thank you. Mine is this. We're about to go into prayer, and then we'll close it with a worship song. Thank you for sticking through this. This is mine is going to be tied to why we even did this, which is weird, different. Thank you for being patient through that. When I look at scriptures, one of the things that I struggle with, and in Exodus in particular, is I don't want to be defending God. One of the quotes that I remember from Augustine, it's attributed sometimes to Augustine, but it also, Charles Spurgeon is the one who popularized it. He said, "The truth is like a lion, you don't have to defend it. Let it loose and it will defend itself." And I know that for a fact. When I was in a different denomination, different church, one of the ways that I looked at the message of Jesus is, instead of like trying to argue with you apologetically or try to defend Jesus, the best way is to say, look what he has done. In the lives of people, hundreds who have gone before me, why do we have to go far? Look at me. Look at what he has done and has been doing in me, right? Look, it's one of the best ways to sort of say, if you still struggle with some of the doubts, look at what he's doing. Now, it is imperfect. There's mess in the church as well, but what he's doing is beautiful and amazing, and it's tangible. And he has been not just changing people, but cultures even, and changing even the course of history through Christians across the world. But having moved into the context of home church, where we want to be a place where people come home to God, we have set out to say we're going to go a step ahead. And we're going to step into the hard conversations. And we're not going to be too quick to answer things or to, dogmatize it with a Bible verse. Just slap a Bible verse on it and please be quiet. We don't talk about those things here. We want to talk about it all. And so the part that I struggle with as I learn to navigate Exodus is, God, could you just provide some answers for these things? Like, it would be really cool if you just kind of added footnotes, or at least you inspired the people to write it. It would be nice if they just wrote in the parts that we do not understand and we struggle with. That's probably the part that I struggle with the most. But it is a new challenge for me, right? And we are stepping as a community to become a place where a skeptic and even an atheist could have a respectful dialogue with us. And we want to then know what we believe really well and go over these passages and do this kind of Q&R where we're like, in a sermon we present you the message of what Jesus is like in that passage. But there are difficult passages and we wanted to present them to you. So we'd love to hear some feedback on that. But remember that at the end of it all, we're preaching not just stories, not even history for that matter. We are preaching God who showed up in the world in Jesus. And life has never been the same since. And he's the one who is at the center of Exodus story. He is the one who shows up, 2,000 years ago in the small village of Bethlehem. And like I said, everything has just been a whirlwind since. And one thing we know for sure is one day all of this is going to come to a conclusion, not to an end, but an end or a start of a new beginning. And we cannot wait for that end as a church. And that's why we work. That's what compels us, is we want more and more people to come and know the one who we've encountered and who's been changing our lives. And we hope will change the lives of our children or our siblings or our families. And maybe most importantly for home church, our communities, right? Like, we are not just to get here comfortable for our evening service. We want to go beyond and really invite others into this new life and have their lives transformed, and for them to walk out not of the Egyptian slavery, but slavery of sin and addiction and darkness and abuse and all of the things that trap humanity all around. Jesus is the one who has the answer to that, and it's him who we get to preach every Sunday. So would you join me in bowing your heads? Or actually, would you stand if you're willing, since we're going to go into worship after this. What? We're not doing the song? Okay. Well, then I guess we close with prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you love us so much and that you've given us an invitation to a new life. We could have been just like anybody else out there, but you've at some point knocked on the door of our heart, and I know that you do that for every person. It's just that somehow we were blessed that either we responded or parents brought and nurtured faith in us, but we have come to know you and experience you, more importantly. And you have already begun the work of freeing us from the baggage of our lives. Lord, and as we stand before you today and think about the story of Exodus and also think about how it all came about in the life of Jesus, I pray that this also becomes a reality for everybody who comes to Home Church. That in their life there would be this exodus from slavery of sin, from slavery of darkness, and an invitation to be freed and then renewed, to become a new kind of people, to become a new kind of a community that is marked by beauty and goodness and kindness and justice and peace and ultimately love, that people would know that we are your disciples because we are full of your love instead of other things, that we are generous and kind when we show up in a neighborhood, Lord, that we stand up for matters of justice, that we show up to those who are brought down by life, Lord. I pray that you would send us out now as you are forming us into community. Send us out to proclaim the good news all around us, Lord, whether it is at work or in our neighborhoods, Father. And would you also help us, Lord, the questions that we wrestled with today? I pray that you would, Lord, equip your church to be good Bible studiers, not just hearing it from the pastor or from the panel, but going and studying for themselves. Father, would you bless each person here to be biblically literate, to desire to know you through scriptures and through personal time with you? Would you bless us, Lord, to know you individually and to know you as a community, and to share that goodness of a relationship with you with others. I pray a blessing of everyone here in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you, guys. Yeah, you can go home now. Bye. See you next Sunday. We are starting a series on core values. That's going to be 10 weeks, where I'm hoping to restart and remind you of why we planted this church. And as we also navigate maybe some of the future changes to what it's going to look like for us to gather here or elsewhere, so that you know what we're all about again. That's what's going to be for the next 10 weeks. So see you next Sunday.